All right. And that brings us to our speaker tonight. Tonight's special guest speaker, Dr. Bob Knight, is the founder and director of the Howard T. Odom Florida Springs Institute, located in High Springs, Florida. Dr. Knight holds a PhD in systems ecology from the University of Florida and has been working in Florida Springs for more than 40 years. He's authored 3 books about Florida Springs, including Silenced Springs, Moving from Tragedy to Hope. Tonight, Dr. Knight will tell us about the threats facing Florida Springs, as well as efforts to protect them for our future. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Bob Knight.
Hello, thank you, Zach, for that introduction, and thank you for introducing me to all your members and your viewers. I'd like to talk to you all tonight about Florida Springs, and I hope most of you have been to Florida one time or another. If you haven't, you may decide to after you see some of these pictures. Florida Springs are just a natural wonder that makes North Florida as great as South Florida, and up here in North Florida, people go to the springs more than they go to the ocean. So, but then our springs are having some significant issues as well, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight as well, and how we can solve the problems facing our springs. We really need to keep these springs sustained well into the future, well beyond our own lifetime. So let me see if I can get started. I'll introduce you to the Florida Springs Institute. We're located in High Springs, Florida. We have our offices there. This is a mural on the wall of the building. You can't miss it. About 1 million people a year go through High Springs to play in the springs every year, creating an economic benefit to the area of about $90 million, according to a University of Florida study. We're there like a filter feeder, trying to bring those people in to educate them more about the springs that they love and that they like to recreate in. We were founded in 2010, over 2 years ago, to promote, protect, and restore and celebrate Florida Springs. Our mission is to provide the best science, independent of the government. We have no government funding whatsoever, and to educate the public about how to be better stewards of Florida Springs, so that through the public's interest in protecting and restoring springs, they will get protected and restored. Here's some pictures of the types of things we do. We conduct spring science continuously. We have for the last 10 years, where we do ecological studies in springs, water quality studies, flow studies. We hold classes that I'll talk about, and we are very knowledgeable about many springs in Florida. I teach at Springs Academy on the first Tuesday of every month. We're virtual with that this year because of COVID, obviously, but we'll be back in operation sometime, probably this summer. But we do it monthly. There's 6 sessions. That's basically based on Springs ecology class that I taught at the University of Florida for a number of years. We start over, so we have 2 sessions of 6 classes a year, and we study the hydrogeology, the chemistry, the biology, the impairments, and the advocacy that are needed for Florida Springs. This is inside the North Florida Springs Environmental Center in High Springs. We have student internships as well. We have 4 3-month sessions of interns during the year, a total of 12 interns a year. The interns are trained in field data collection, data entry, analysis, and springs ecology, and they actually enjoy getting in the springs year-round. And so this is really important. Our interns are college students, and there are so many young, passionate college students about the environment that it's just very rewarding for us to meet these young people and to see their enthusiasm about springs. We're partnering in various ways. One of our biggest fundraisers of the year is the Springs Run. This is a partnership with the First Magnitude Brewing Company. You note the name and note that it's a 7.2 kilometer run. We did it virtually this year, and we didn't have as many runners as last year, where we had over 700. But we had a good number. It helped raise interest and knowledge about springs and raise some money for the Florida Springs Institute. We do science continuously as well, and we have several websites that are interconnected. The Blue Water Audit Project has been our largest project to date. It's a 4-year project. We're in the last year of it right now, but it is a unique idea that takes the whole Springs region of North Florida, 27 million acres, about 2/3 of the state of Florida, and about half the state's population live in the Springs region, and evaluates and estimates the footprint of everybody, every landowner and person in North Florida. And so we estimate the footprint in terms of a person's nitrogen load to the Floridan aquifer, and we estimate the footprint of a person's groundwater extraction. And we do that for every property over 5 acres, and then we lump cities and urban areas together with the residents. But it's the GIS analysis. It's based on about 12 different overlapping data sets. And we end up with parcel-specific information, like this map shows the nitrogen load in Marion County around Silver Springs. The darker colors being, the darker browns being the highest loading rates, severe loading rates that have the potential to raise nitrogen water to very unhelpful levels. And you see east of the Ottawaha River there is the light brown is the Wakulla National Forest that has much lower nitrogen loading rates. We have just wrapped up a 3-year study on the lower Santa Fe River springs. The Santa Fe River is a really interesting river. It's the largest tributary to the Suwannee River. We studied it for multiple years to fill the data gaps. We studied 61 different spring and river stations, collecting water quality, water quantity, vegetation, wildlife, ecosystem function. We put extra focus on some of the most important springs: Santa Fe Spring, Hornsby Spring, Poe Spring, Gilchrist Blue, a new state park, Ginny Springs, and Nitrate-Nitrogen Springs. Not only the science, but how to restore these key springs. The Santa Fe River has a long history of being an unimpacted river, and became an outstanding Florida water in 1987 based on its natural beauty and importance as a protected system. Well, it's been going downhill ever since then, unfortunately. At that time, springs were putting out 1 billion gallons a day of groundwater on average into the Santa Fe River, feeding a river that had an average flow of just about 1.3 billion. So the springs were putting in almost 80% of the flow. They're still putting in flow, but the flow in the river, the base flow in the rivers declined by 20%. And that's what we just had a big Zoom meeting, public meeting yesterday about these issues. A video will be available on our website. SPRINGSWATCH. We have had a citizen science springs monitoring program in place for about 8 years. It's volunteer. It's based on ecological measures at a number of springs that help give us some idea. Most springs in Florida are receiving no monitoring other than what we're giving. But for Silver Springs, that was the first site for our SPRINGSWATCH. Nitrate-Nitrogen Springs, Homosassa Springs, Rainbow Springs, Weeki-Wachee Springs, Santa Fe Springs, Wakulla Spring, the Aquifer River. We're adding several more spring systems this year in the Panhandle. This is a very important way to educate people. The SPRINGSWATCH volunteers learn a lot about their system. They learn a lot about caring for their spring system. And we have a dashboard, of course, where the data that they're collecting are put up on a regular basis. We have many other educational tools at the Florida Springs Institute. We have a Florida Springs map that maps out the 1,000+ springs in Florida with information about how to get to them. like a Google Earth map with their water quality and quantity data if it's available. We're creating outreach tools, guides for people using springs. We have wonderful videos of more than a dozen fish species that live in springs. And we have a fish guide, waterproof guide you can actually take in the springs with you. And we're doing more guides like this. I think our biggest project coming up is raising the money to build the Silver Springs Environmental Center. This is going to be located in Silver Springs State Park. It'll be a statewide epicenter for spring science and education. It'll have research facilities, ecology exhibits. It's really modeled on the Florida Oceanographic Institute's, our society's wonderful center. And this will be the future headquarters for the Florida Springs Institute. We're not going to abandon High Springs; it's too important. We'll have satellite offices as well, but this is a big project I'm excited about. Well, now I'll get into some of the science and importance of springs and show you some pretty pictures while I'm doing that, at least to start. And the pictures get uglier in the latter part of the talk. But first of all, where's the Floridan Aquifer? What is the Floridan Aquifer? Well, the Floridan Aquifer is a massive limestone rock under the surface of the earth that extends in some places over 3,000 feet and is porous, very porous, and that allows the storage of underground water called groundwater. It's natural. It was there. We got it for free when Florida was taken over by Europeans. It extends not just under the whole state of Florida, but under a very large part of Georgia and into South Carolina and even into Alabama and Mississippi. It covers 100,000 square miles. It's one of the largest aquifers in the world, and the volume may be the largest aquifer in the world. What does it look like? Well, this is a picture inside the Floridan Aquifer. This is a cave system down by Wakulla Springs in Southwest Florida. And it's passageways. Some of them are just amazing. We have one of the most popular cave diving areas in Florida and world here in Florida, North Florida. And you can see these cave divers. It's like you could fly an airplane through some of these caves here in Florida. They're water filled. You'd never know it, except these people are not floating in the air. They're floating in water, but about several hundred feet below the land surface. Where does the water come from in the Floridan Aquifer? It all comes from rain. An average of 12 billion gallons every day recharges the Floridan Aquifer. Of course, you get more when it's rainy, you get less when it's dry, but that's the average, 12 billion gallons a day. And that was the average flow in the springs of Florida pre-development, pre-installation of wells into this vast, vast aquifer. What's a spring? Well, a spring is anywhere where groundwater comes to the land surface. This is a picture of Gilchrist Blue Spring. It's a spring, essentially a sink. You can think of it as a sinkhole full of water, but there's so much water pressure in the aquifer that it's actually above the land surface in some places, and that's why it's called an artesian aquifer, and that forces water out of these sinkholes as springs. They're beautiful places under their natural conditions. The water is extremely clean, lacks all particulate substances, which makes it look blue in perspective. So Florida is the land of 1,000 springs. There are 1,090 registered or named springs in the state of Florida right now. You know probably some of them, if not many. Wakulla Springs down near Orlando, Rock Springs, Wakulla Springs, the land of the mermaids, Crystal River Springs, the land of 700 or 800 manatees in the winter. Silver Springs, formerly the largest spring in the world in terms of flow and in the United States. Rainbow Springs, a wonderful tubing site and a beautiful river. The Ichetucknee Springs and River, and Madison Blue on the upper Withlacoochee. Wakulla, our spring at the Capitol where all our legislators go, and Hobnob, Jackson Blue Springs in the Panhandle, and many others. The biggest concentration of these springs is really in the Suwannee River Basin, over 300 springs in that water management district. Santa Fe is a tributary to the Suwannee River, like I pointed out. So our springs have been home for wildlife for millions of years. There are many dependent species that use Florida springs, and some of those species are gone. And humans first occupied this land around these springs possibly as early as 20 to 30,000 years ago. And they've left their tangible remains from hunting mammoths, mastodons, horses, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and of course people were prey at that time as well. In fact, they were probably being preyed on more than they were preying on saber-toothed cats. And this is what we find associated with springs. We find the fossils of these animals, these extinct fauna. We find the artifactual remains of these cultures that lived long, long ago. And they lived near the springs. They lived near the water. During that time, that prehistoric time, early on in the Pleistocene, Florida was a very dry place, comparable to the grasslands of northern Africa. And people lived near the springs because they were sinkholes with carved windows, a view into the underlying aquifer. Well, springs commerce really developed as Florida was populated more and more. The Ocklawaha, for example, the Ocklawaha River was opened up from tree falls and became a highway to Silver Springs. And this is Silver Springs in the 1880s. There were regular visits at a hotel at Silver Springs. By that time, people were visiting the springs by the 1850s after the Civil War. And this became a form of commerce. The commerce of agriculture in Central Florida and lumber was exported down these riverboats, and tourists were brought into Florida. It was a lot easier than taking a stagecoach at the time. Springs in Florida are incredibly important for recreation in our age. Tens of millions of people visit the springs each year. So many paddle sports, kayaks, canoes, tubing, swimming, diving. Springs are they are the alternative to the beaches, if you will. And springs continue to be wildlife habitat. This is a fairly recent picture of the striped bass that occupy Silver Glen Springs during the summer to escape the heat, the hot water in the St. Johns River. Up to 10,000 of large striped bass come into Silver Glen Springs and are totally dependent on the cool water that's issuing forth from the Floridan aquifer. And on the opposite tack, you have manatees that are totally dependent on springs to live in Florida. They have to have warmer water in the wintertime, or they'll die. And this is why manatees have expanded their range and have occupied their range with over 5,000 manatees in Florida now because of the availability of springs. This is a potential problem associated with the declining flows of our springs. And of course, springs have opened our eyes into this underworld, if you will, the Floridan aquifer. This is easily the most important natural resource in Florida, other than sunlight, is our groundwater. Our aquifers are where about 98% of potable water comes from in Florida. And we're dependent on it for irrigation. We're dependent on it for industry. We're dependent on it for all the terrible things we do, like bottled water. The Floridan aquifer is really important. The fact that we can actually swim into the Floridan aquifer, measure its health, and explore it and understand it better is extremely important to our future. So I'll speak some about our problems now, and this is just a warning. It's not all pretty. So our biggest problem with our springs is that they're losing their flow, and that is directly tied to our consumption of groundwater as humans. And we're not just using a little bit of water. We've gone from, if you want to say, 0 to 60 in what seems like a few seconds. Our groundwater consumption is very high compared to the amount of recharge we have to the aquifer. And because of that, our groundwater levels are declining. And the way springs work is there has to be a level of water in the aquifer, essentially of pressure in the aquifer, that's higher than the level of the opening in the earth for springs to flow. And whenever the level in the groundwater falls, the flow of springs declines. And we have some very significant declines in aquifer levels in Florida. And so our spring flows are lower. Now, springs work like a bucket. Water's coming in at the surface of the earth through recharge. The bucket has holes in it, and those are the springs. And the holes are at different levels in the bucket. Some of the holes are near the top of the bucket. And if aquifer levels fall a little bit, those springs at the highest levels are the ones that lose their flow first. Unfortunately, Silver Springs is right in the middle of the state. It's one of the highest springs in terms of elevation, and it's losing its flow faster than any other major spring in the state. The holes that are further down in the bucket take advantage of that, and they basically pirate the water that used to come out of Silver Springs. Some of that water now is coming out of Rainbow Springs. The spring shed for Silver is getting smaller. The spring shed for Rainbow is getting larger. And Rainbow also is losing flow, but not nearly as fast because of that pirating effect. So the Floridan aquifer, I indicated, underlies a very large area. It's not just pumping in Florida that affects the aquifer. It's pumping in Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi. 7 million acres in North Florida. That's pretty much the whole part of North Florida north of I-4. The pumping now, and this in 2000 was about 3.5 billion gallons a day. The pumping now is up to 4 billion gallons a day. About 3.6 billion gallons a day is equivalent to 30% of the entire discharge to all our springs. So we're pumping right now 30 to 40% of the total recharge that's historically reached our springs. Just in 3 of the water management districts in Florida, based on this inventory we did a number of years ago, there were 29,000 large permits. These are permits that are generally over 100,000 gallons a day. 29,000 of these large wells sucking water out of the springs. I compare it to putting a lot of springs in a milkshake and sucking it. And the more straws, putting a lot of straws in a milkshake and sucking. There are a lot of straws in the Floridan aquifer. In 2010, the estimated pumping just in the Florida portion of the aquifer was 2.6 billion gallons a day. It's another billion gallons a day being pumped in Georgia. But the total allocated amount just in these large wells, for these large wells, is 4.6 billion gallons a day. That if everybody pumped at the same time, which they do during a dry year, that's half of the total recharge of the Floridan aquifer. And you can expect the spring flows overall to go down over 50%. So let's look at a case history with the Suwannee River Basin. This is the Suwannee River Water Management District. The land uses are shown. Agriculture is the bright red. Green is mostly forest, natural areas. And you see the springs, the yellow dots all up the river, down the river, the Santa Fe River, the Wakulla River, the Steinhatchee River, the Alcilla River. These are all the big springs. Well, these are the wells in that same area. These are the wells that go with those agricultural fields that the agricultural land use you saw. There's over 3,000 large wells in the Suwannee River District. The green wells to the right are in the St. Johns River Water Management District. This is what they look like on the ground. This is an aerial photo of one farm, Suwannee Farm, 40 pivots, drawing water from the aquifer. For free, by the way. That doesn't cost them anything for that water. So this is a picture of one of the springs that historically fed the Suwannee River, White Sulfur Springs. It was an incredible tourist attraction and health spa in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. It's said that Henry Flagler got the idea to build a railroad down through Florida to develop it by staying at one of the 8 hotels that used to be in White Springs. This is White Springs a few years ago. In the 1960s, White Springs essentially started stopping flow, and to the point where it has stopped flow for most of the time now. A large phosphate mine went in nearby and really had a big impact on it, as well as the pumping as far away, 60 miles away in Jacksonville, was affecting the flow of the spring. The Floridan Aquifer is like a large Slurpee cup, and there are millions of straws in it that are withdrawing water from this one aquifer. And this is what happens to a spring, a major spring. And this is what happens to a river. All of the major rivers in North Florida are spring-fed rivers. The Suwannee is like the Santa Fe. This significant part of the average annual flow in the Suwannee River, well over 50%, is spring flow. It's called base flow. When the springs stop flowing, the Suwannee River stops flowing. The Suwannee River springs have lost about 40% of their flow based on the latest inventory. So that was, as if that wasn't enough, let's talk about another problem, and that is pollution. We're polluting our aquifer. We're polluting the water we drink, and we're doing it knowingly, and the state is sanctioning it and not preventing it. They have plans to prevent it in the next 20 years, but they're not preventing it, and no spring has none of the major springs have declining nitrogen levels, and it's widespread in the aquifer, and springs are very sensitive to elevated nitrate. One of the manifestations we're seeing is a combination of reduced flows and elevated nitrate is algal blooms in springs. More and more springs are losing their native vegetation or just being taken over by filamentous algae. And the reason is a portion of what we put on the land surface ends up down in the aquifer. A pretty large portion of all the fertilizer we put on the land, the wastewater we put out, and these are just some of those sources, some of the major sources. The figure in the upper left is a spray field, a wastewater spray field. So human wastewater is being put on the land intentionally to recharge the aquifer, but without regard to removing the nitrogen before it goes on the land. Animal waste, incredible amount of nitrogen goes into the ground on these intensive dairies. Septic tanks, we have 2 million septic tanks in Florida. Septic tanks don't treat nitrogen. All they do is, in the drain field, they protect the groundwater from bacteria, but they don't remove the nitrogen. The vast majority of the nitrogen from these 2 million septic tanks is going into the groundwater, and then from there either to surface waters or to the Floridan aquifer where it comes out in springs. So the biggest nitrogen input to Silver Springs, and Silver Springs has a lot of nitrogen coming in, as you'll see, is from septic tanks. And then fertilizer, agricultural fertilizers, urban fertilizers, but the majority of our springs contamination is from agricultural nitrogen fertilizers. And this is the way it looks. When you put together all the 20-some thousand groundwater wells that had data, which we did back in 2006 or so when we prepared this figure, you see that we've contaminated a large part of the Floridan aquifer. These areas that are in orange and yellow are way above background. Background is blue. It's less than 0.1 parts per million or milligrams per liter. Green is contaminated. Green is above the spring standard. And then everything else is just more and more on top. It's quite daunting because these are the karst vulnerable areas of the state. These are the areas where there's no protective clay layer over the Floridan aquifer. There's just sand. And so they're easily contaminated by any nitrogen loading that's going on. You see, there's even some in South Florida, but they're especially in the karst region of the state where the springs are. About a third of the state is above the groundwater standard for springs, 0.35 parts per million. And almost 20% of the state is above 1, which is getting into human health issues. Here's a close-up of that map. You see where Silver Springs is located? It's in a karst area, of course, and it's an area that's heavily with nitrate-nitrogen. Ginny Springs is in this Santa Fe drainage. It's heavily contaminated with nitrate-nitrogen, and more agriculture, more intensive agriculture going in every year Wakulla Springs, surrounded by septic tanks. They don't even know how many septic tanks for sure around Wakulla Springs, but one estimate puts it over 70,000 septic tanks in that area. Wakulla Springs, the same thing. These concentrations are very high. Any concentration in the orange or red could be lethal to humans. Silver Springs nitrate concentrations, you can see their rise. We have a long data record at Silver Springs. You see the standard at 0.35, the red bar, and you see the current level as of this figure, which was a decade ago. The levels now are up to 1.6 or more, a rise of over 3,500%. A system that historically put out less than 50 tons per year of nitrogen puts out over 600 tons per year now, and is heading higher with every year. The state has determined that nitrogen, 79% of the nitrogen needs to be removed from the groundwater that's polluting Silver Springs. And the state has a plan to do that, but the state hasn't made any progress along that plan. And it's supposed to be done in 15 years now. This is what a healthy spring looked like in the 1960s, Wakulla Spring, dominated by submerged crystal clear water. This is Wakulla Springs in 2013. It's a biological desert. Filamentous algae is not palatable for aquatic organisms. Almost nothing will eat it. And it does not support the kind of food chain that we're used to in springs. And on top of that, this is our drinking water that we're contaminating. There are many places where wells are above the human health standard, which is meant to prevent blue baby syndrome, methemoglobinemia. But there are many more areas where the nitrate levels are above levels of nitrate that have been shown to cause cancer in humans. A 3 to 5-fold increased risk of cancer at 2.5 parts per million, which it turns out some of our bottled water is that high or close to that level. So if you think you're getting bottled springs water, it may have levels over 2 parts per million. So this is one of our springs, one of our beautiful springs, then and now, is taken by John Moran. Fanning Springs. It's downstream on the Suwannee River. It was a first magnitude spring, over 100 cubic feet per second. It's no longer a first magnitude spring, down about 70 cubic feet per second. It's one of the most contaminated springs, large springs in the state. Historically less than 0.1 parts per million, now over 5 parts per million and going up to 6 as we speak. This shows the nitrogen load in the Suwannee River from these 300 springs, or 200 and some springs that actually feed the Suwannee River directly. The nitrogen load is rising in the Suwannee River. This is a chart that goes nitrate data from the 1950s up to 2011 at Brantford, which is midway down the middle Suwannee River. The nitrogen load in the Suwannee River now is over 6,000 tons of nitrogen per year. That's comparable to the same amount of nitrogen that's going out from Lake Okeechobee to in the St. Lucie River and the Caloosahatchee River. I think it's actually greater, but ask Gary Goforth. I hope Gary's out there tonight. Hey, Gary. This is unbelievable. We are doing the same thing to our rivers that is happening to the rivers in South Florida. And once again, the Suwannee River is considered a pristine, outstanding Florida water that's not supposed to have any water quality degradation compared to what was there in the 1980s. And things are just getting worse and worse. There's no realistic effort at the state level to solve these problems. We have plans that are not worth any more than the paper they're printed on. So, sort of in summary, but I'm not done yet, but in summary, the Floridan aquifer is overutilized. Pumping is too great. Pumping during dry years is half of the recharge, the average recharge of the aquifer. And of course, the recharge is less in dry years. We need to cut back on groundwater pumping. This is life or death for the springs and the rivers of North Florida. If we keep increasing the pumping, and the state is still giving out new pumping permits. Today, the Suwannee River Water Management District reissued the permit for a much greater amount of water for the Ginny Springs bottling plant owned by Nestle right now. That happened today. And there are permits being given out every year. Over 2,000 new wells and permits were given out since the Suwannee River Water Management District issued the minimum flows and levels for the Santa Fe River. That said that Santa Fe River was already in harm. In addition to that, we're polluting the water we're drinking by using fertilizer, by putting our wastewater intentionally into the ground. We're killing ourselves slowly at a slow enough level you can't see it, but it's happening. And so the Springs Institute for the last 10 years, I've been aware of these issues for decades, having studied Silver Springs in the 70s, having worked as an environmental consultant for the water management districts at the beginning of in the beginning of 2002, and working ever since then on Springs, leaving that field and working as a director of a nonprofit to try to protect and restore springs since 2010. We've been producing over a dozen restoration plans for springs, very comprehensive science-based plans on how to restore springs. We finally produced an overall springs conservation plan for all of Florida springs, the 1,090 springs. We prepared essentially health assessments for 32 Sentinel springs, springs that had adequate historic and current data to see what their health was with respect to flows, salinity. We're salinating the Floridan Aquifer as well, by the way, and nitrate. The key pollutant in our springs is nitrate. And we found that half of the springs received a D or lower of these 32 Sentinel springs. A significant number received an F: Silver Springs, Rainbow Springs, Fanning Springs, Crystal Springs, the home of Zephyr Hills Water. These springs have lost a significant amount of their flow. Some of them have rising salinity to dangerous levels, indicating we're salinating the aquifer, and have rising nitrate levels. And none of the springs received anything above a B+, even the ones in the Ocala National Forest. So how do we protect our springs? I've been hitting my head against this for decades. So to adopt a phrase that we may not wish to adopt, but anyway, I'd like to make our springs great again. I want to do it for not just myself, but for my children and their children. What can we do to protect water quality? What we as individuals can do. And if you're living south of I-4, there may not be much you can do other than just join us in our fight to save springs. But those of us that live in North Florida, north of I-4, we need to be conscientious of all the water we use. We shouldn't be watering our lawns. We shouldn't be watering landscaping. We should go to springs-friendly watering habits, which mean no aquifer water being used for watering your landscaping and your lawns. You should totally rely on rainfall and rain capture. Put in a cistern, have rain barrels, water your plants that way, and use less water yourself. Use less electricity, and encourage your family and friends and your friends in South Florida to do the same. How do we protect the water quality? Use fertilizers sparingly, or just stop using them. We should not be using fertilizers over the vulnerable portions of the Floridan Aquifer, which are the karst areas of North Florida. And in some places in South Florida, check the Blue Water Audit. You can figure out your own nitrogen footprint and figure out where you live if you've got a problem. If you are going to fertilize, you use slow release fertilizers. Don't fertilize during the summer at all when it's raining. You shouldn't fertilize at all. But these other things are, if you just can't help yourself. But I'd much rather prefer you to put a springs-friendly yard with no fertilizer. Just use totally native plants and let the rain support them. And what we've actually done is a giant hole We've dug a giant hole in the aquifer. Our state has allowed us to do that by not making it clear what the problems were that we were creating. We need to put a cap on all groundwater withdrawals. Groundwater is too valuable to be wasting it on lots of uses. We need to put a fee on all groundwater withdrawals. If we're going to allow groundwater withdrawals, existing ones, once we put a cap on them, there should be no new ones. There should be a decline in the amount of groundwater withdrawn. And the best way to get there is to put a price on the groundwater. Provide enough groundwater for people's basic needs of living, but put a cap on it and put a fee on it so that that will discourage excessive uses. It's free now. People in cities pay for water. Everybody else in the country doesn't, and neither do farmers, and neither does Nestle. Nestle doesn't pay for the water. We need to put a cap and fee on all human-based nitrogen sources, anthropogenic nitrogen sources. And that means if you have a septic tank, you should be paying a fee comparable to what people pay in the city to treat the nitrogen in their wastewater. And our cities need to all go to advanced treatment before they go to any kind of land application. I've reviewed the data from land applications all over North Florida. The majority of them have contaminated the groundwater to 10 parts per million or more nitrate-nitrogen, which is toxic, acutely toxic to human babies, and way above cancer levels. And then once we put a fee on these things, that money, the groundwater belongs to all of us. The aquifer belongs to all of us. That's our water, that's our money. That shouldn't go to water bottling companies. No fee should. Fee should go to the state of Florida, and it should be labeled as aquifer protection fees. That money should be put into buying out the farmers, putting conservation easements on those that are most egregious in their water use and their nitrogen load to the aquifer. And it should be going into protecting land, vulnerable lands in the Springshed. That will do the most to protect our aquifer. And these actions will cost the taxpayer nothing. Okay, what else can you do? Well, you can read what we've done. You can educate yourself. We have an incredible website that with all this information that we've been developing over the last 10 years. We have, my book is, of course, for sale. It's a donation, and none of that money goes to me. I've got several more books out there. A great new one about Silver Springs and history there with Marion Rizzo, another author. A book about Death by a Thousand Cuts. We have Aquatic Adventures, this wonderful book that we did for younger citizens who want to learn more about our springs. It's factually accurate, and yet it's tuned into youngsters, and you can find out how to get that from the Springs Institute website. Visit a spring tomorrow. If you don't know about our springs, you're missing something. Springs are half of what makes Florida great. The Everglades and the rest of it is the other half, but springs are amazing. You can take a kayak out on Silver Springs right now and just about be sure of seeing some manatees. Some have escaped through the lock and into the river and now are living in the Silver River. There was a manatee in Gilchrist Blue Springs this week. There has been for the last week. That's a very friendly manatee. Come to our classes. We a professional class called Give Springs a Break. Our Springs Field School is open for enrollment right now, but it's just about full, and that's coming in early March this year. We had to cancel it last year. We have Springs outings on a monthly basis, and those will start up again soon. And our Springs Academy will start once COVID's passed. Volunteer. You can volunteer for us. If you want to be involved in the SPRINGSWATCH project, that's a very wonderful way to volunteer. And these are SPRINGSWATCH volunteers. So there's lots of opportunities. And finally, I want to wrap this up with extending a hand to those of you that live in South Florida. Water quality and quantity bind North and South Florida together inextricably. We are not competing with each other. We should not be competing with each other for funds to restore South Florida and the Okeechobee system and the Everglades and the springs of North Florida. These are there. The money is there to do it, and we need to be able to raise more money by stopping the pollution and stopping the consumption, and get rid of this green, this lovely green that has taken over our springs and our rivers. These terrible sights of dead and dying fish and guacamole algae. And I know that these are tied to politics. I've hit my head against the political wall for the last 10 years. It's not what I focus on. I focus on the science and the education, but the politics are really bad for Florida, and the public needs to wake up and realize that if they don't change the political climate in Florida, the environmental climate in Florida is not going to improve. And to do that, we need to join our hands together to ensure a happy future and get political. As individuals, we can, not as nonprofits, but as individuals, we can. Attend rallies, oppose permits, join groups, and there are wonderful Springs groups all over the state. The Florida Springs Council has over 50 member organizations, and the Florida Springs Council is the advocacy arm for Springs. We're the science arm and education arm. Florida Springs Council, we helped start that, and it's the advocacy group for lobbying for Springs, for putting in legislative initiatives, and for challenging bad permits. But there's many other groups like Rainbow River Conservation, Silver Springs Alliance, Homosassa Springs Alliance, Kings Bay Springs Alliance, Friends of Wakulla. There's so many places you can help. And finally, if you really want to help the Springs Institute, help sponsor the Silver Springs Environmental Center. This is just a dream now. It's a dream on paper. We've got seed money to start it, but it's been a really bad year to raise funds for this. And this is what we need. We needed a central hotspot for springs protection in Florida. The Florida Park Service has said we can put that in Silver Springs. We just need to raise the money to do it. And clean and abundant water will likely be the most important environmental issue affecting our future. I think it already does affect you and I. And you can contact us this way. This is our contact information. We'd be glad to hear from you. And I want to really thank Zach and the board of the Oceanographic, or the Florida Oceanographic Society, for inviting me to speak tonight. Thank you very much.
Wow, what a fantastic presentation. I don't even know where to begin. I think first I'm heartbroken that I'm not going to be able to explore all 1,000 plus of our springs in a pristine state. It's a little bit of a drive for me to get from Stuart up to North Florida, but seeing your presentation tonight has sparked a strong desire for me to get up there and spend some more time looking at these incredible bodies of water. And I hope, you had an audience of 246 people tonight, and questions are pouring in as we're talking now. I'm hoping that your presentation has motivated everybody to go out and explore a spring and find out how important they are and see them firsthand. And I love that you wrapped up with that important connection between North Florida's water issues and South Florida's water issues. Obviously, Florida Oceanographic Society, located at the mouth of the St. Lucie, is heavily invested in educating and advocating for the health of the Everglades and our coastal estuaries. But the nutrient problems are the same. I mean, it boils down to fertilizer and waste, whether you're dealing with algae blooms in North Florida Springs or cyanobacteria blooms in Lake Okeechobee. So that's a really important take home and a great tie-in. And it's also a good segue to our first question. Folks, remember, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box. We are happy to stick around for quite a while tonight. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. So this first question is actually a South Florida question. Can you please comment on the risks to the Floridan aquifer associated with planned deep injection wells north of Lake Okeechobee? So this is an Everglades restoration type of question.
I certainly can. I worked in water and wastewater for most of my career, and a lot in South Florida. Worked a lot on the STAs with Gary Goforth and many other people. And I know a lot about injection wells from having been concerned about that myself. The Floridan aquifer does extend under South Florida. However, it's saline. It's not the water that feeds our springs. The water is saline, and it's been used for decades as a disposal site for polluted waters. And this is nothing new. There are injection wells all over South Florida already. I don't know that there's any north of the lake yet, but there certainly have been some south of the lake. The freshwater portion of the aquifer does extend all the way down to north of the lake. Part of it does. There are no springs south of I-4, but the portion of the aquifer that feeds the springs does include Okeechobee County and the area north of the lake. So it would be a real mistake to put wells through that freshwater portion of the aquifer into the saline boulder zone, they call it, and dispose of waste that way. It could really lead to contamination, in my opinion.
And I see a kind of a good follow-up question. How many aquifers exist in Florida? You know, we hear about the boulder zone, we hear about shallow aquifers. With regards to South Florida's water issues particularly, is it more than the Floridan aquifer, or is that our only aquifer? Are there deep aquifers and shallow aquifers that are separate, or is it really just one big body of groundwater?
So an aquifer is any storage of water underground and that can be tapped for use, and that's pretty much the definition. In South Florida, the Floridan, like I said, it actually dips down as you go from north to south in Florida with depth. And so in South Florida, the Floridan aquifer is thousands of feet below the land surface. In North Florida, it's at the land surface. That's why we have springs. But in South Florida, the Floridan aquifer is quite deep, and it's saline. Like I said, it still has the salt water in it from the last time Florida was completely under the ocean. But there are aquifers, there's limestone all the way up to the land surface in South Florida. You see it when you go out in the Everglades, you're walking on limestone. And there are freshwater aquifers there. The Biscayne aquifer is the large one that is that much of South Florida around Miami area depends upon. The Biscayne aquifer is extremely vulnerable. And just like the Floridan aquifer is further north, the Biscayne aquifer in many cases just has sand over it. And so anything put on the surface may contaminate it. The first job I worked on consulting back in 1981 was to go down and sample contaminated wells at Superfund sites in the Biscayne aquifer. And it's a very transmissive aquifer. Of course, there's a lot of rain in South Florida. There's a lot of water in the Biscayne aquifer, but there's not as much storage as there is in the Floridan aquifer. So it can be depleted as well. And then there are other aquifers along the coast. There's some indeterminate, undefined, unnamed aquifers. Some of them have names. There's a sand and gravel aquifer in the panhandle of Florida as you go further west from where the springs are to Pensacola. There's a sand and gravel aquifer. So yeah, any storage underground that's fresh is probably being tapped in Florida. Southwest Florida has an intermediate aquifer. So there are a lot of different aquifers that we use. But the Floridan supplies more water than any other aquifer in the state of Florida.
We have a bunch of questions coming in regarding Nestle Foods and their extraction of water from Jenny Springs. You mentioned a news update. I mean, it sounded like this was a current, as of today, news update regarding their extraction permit. So I'm going to try to kind of compile all these questions into one set of questions. I guess for viewers who aren't familiar with what's happening with Nestle and Jenny Springs, maybe you could start with a quick update. And then a lot of the questions ask, what are the impacts of that extraction of water for drinking water? And then what do we do to stop that, or how do we prevent that?
Certainly. Jenny Springs is a natural Santa Fe River, right in the sort of in the heart of the springs that line the Santa Fe River. And there's over 30 named springs on the river. Jenny Springs is privately owned, as all the springs were historically, but many of the springs now are in public ownership. But Jenny Springs isn't, and Jenny Springs Outdoors is the name of the holding company that owns Jenny Springs. It's just really one family that owns Jenny Springs Outdoors. Jenny Springs itself includes, I think, 7 springs, named springs. So it's not just Jenny Springs. There's Devil's Eye, Devil's Ear, the Devil's Group. There's Tree House, Tear Springs. So they collectively are first magnitude set of springs. They put out over 100 cubic feet per second. The private family that owns Jenny Springs obtained a groundwater pumping permit, a water use permit from Suwannee River Water Management District over 20 years ago. And they did that because a water bottling company wanted to put a bottling plant in near the spring. And so they got a permit from the state for a modest permit fee and started selling that water to the bottling company. Well, since then, excuse me, I don't know exactly how many, but I think we're up at number 4 or 5 in terms of companies that have owned that bottling plant. Coca-Cola was one along the way, and they sold out to Ice River, which was a Canadian company. And now Nestle has bought that bottling plant. They don't own the spring. The family that owns Jenny Springs Outdoors owns the wells that are providing water, and they're being paid for that water as if they owned that water. They don't really own that water, but they have the permit to extract it. Well, none of the bottling companies before ever used the full amount of that permit. It was for a little over 1 million gallons a day, which is a lot of water. That's enough water for 10,000 people to live on. But it was over 1 million gallons a day, but they were only pumping up to about 200,000 gallons a day on average. Only, it's still a lot of water. But Nestle buying it wants to use all of that water, the whole permit. And so today they got after some legal wrangling, they got the permit issued by the governing board of the Suwannee River Water Management District for about 0.98 million gallons a day. And they intend to use all that water. It's very likely that they will truck some of that water to other bottling plants, including their Madison County bottling plant, where they have a permit for Madison Blue Springs, which unfortunately for them goes dark when the Withlacoochee River back floods into the depleted Floridan Aquifer. So that's where we are. But the latest news even more is that Nestle has sold their entire North American water operation to a whole couple of holding firms that are going to totally change the landscape. But part of it, I'm sure part of that deal was having this permit. I don't know that, but I would guess that it was like $4.3 billion for that sale. And I imagine part of it was the assurance that they would have a permit for 900,000 gallons a day at that bottling plant.
So yet another example of a private company using our public water. So Florida seems to have a specialty license plate for just about everything. One of our guests had a question about the Protect Florida Springs license plate. They're wondering what those funds are used for, roughly how much money is generated each year through the sale of that license plate.
We do not have that license plate deal with the state. Cedar Shore Alliance does, which is more in line with what you guys do. They proposed it originally. They obtained it, and they've had it for years. The money's managed through the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida, which is associated with FWC, and through Cedar Shore Alliance. They give out grants every year. We call them Springs Tag Grants. They're wonderful. We've gotten grants every year that they've been given to the Florida Springs Institute. I'm not complaining at all, but I believe the Springs tags are raising between $200,000 and $300,000 a year for that group, and that's a lot of money, and maybe more than that. I haven't checked in the last few years. We've done a lot of really neat projects. Our SPRINGSWATCH projects, many of them have been started with seed money from those tag grants.
Great. One of our attendees has a question about a Springs-friendly lawn. They're wondering if you have any resources that are easily available to help people if they want to convert their lawn to more of a Springs-friendly landscaping plan.
That's a project that's sort of a light bulb in the mind of one of our employees. It's not done yet. I can tell you just the simplest thing is what I said in my slides. Don't use any fertilizer if you're over vulnerable areas. If you're over the Hawthorne Formation, and it's 50 feet thick underneath your property, that fertilizer is not going to get into the springs. What it'll do is some of it may be getting to local water bodies. So if you're near a lake or a stream or something like that in a well-confined area, you probably shouldn't use as much fertilizer or any fertilizer as well. But a spring-friendly lawn is one that's in these karst areas that doesn't use any fertilizer and doesn't use any groundwater. Rely on rainwater, and if you're let your grass turn brown in the winter, it comes right back. Many of us up here don't irrigate our lawns, and of course, people put in landscaping that requires irrigation. One of the biggest crops in Florida is St. Augustine grass. So rip it out. I know a lot of people up here who love springs that are doing just that. They're putting in just native plants. They're not irrigating with groundwater. They're cutting back their own use. For example, the average Floridian uses about 150 to 170 gallons per day on average. 150 to 170 gallons per day. You only need 1 gallon a day to survive. That's what your body needs. 1 gallon a day, and it can be in the form of beer or margaritas or whatever, but not bottled water. Please don't buy bottled water. But we use 150 gallons per day. Well, my wife and I put in a water meter. We live in the country. We have a private well. We could use all the water we want. We just leave it on all the time. We could water our lawn. We don't. We put it in a water meter. We use about 30 gallons a day each. We're totally civilized. We take showers. We do laundry. We wash our dishes. We don't really skimp, but you don't need 150 gallons a day to survive. And if you're in town, of course, you may be paying for that high usage. But everybody can use, almost everybody, except people that live on sailboats, can use less water a day than they use right now. And it's, if you can, put a cistern in, live on rainfall like everybody in the islands does. That's the way in the Caribbean, everybody lives with a cistern. And that's the way we should be living in Florida in the Springs region. So we don't have to pump. We're pumping almost 1 billion gallons a day for potable water use in North Florida. And we shouldn't. That we don't need to pump nearly that much.
You talked a lot about nitrogen pollution tonight and its impacts on the health of our springs. One of our viewers is wondering, is there any way to remove nitrogen from the water? I guess both surface water before it enters the aquifer, as well as nitrogen contamination in the aquifer itself.
There certainly is, and that's what I spent most of my career doing, designing wetlands for that. So the form of nitrogen that's really soluble and travels into our drinking water is nitrate. Nitrate is an oxidized form of nitrogen. It doesn't react with hardly anything. It's very stable. And once it's in groundwater or surface water, it's stable except for one biological process called denitrification. And so nitrate can be removed, but only under certain conditions. You have to have 3 things to remove nitrate from surface water or groundwater. You have to have the nitrate. You have to have anaerobic oxygen. The bacteria that does the process of denitrification can only live anaerobically, and you have to have organic matter. And so in the aquifer, once nitrate gets in the aquifer, as long as it's not contaminated by waste, there isn't any organic matter. There's nitrate. The bacteria can live in the aquifer, and they do to a certain extent, but there isn't enough organic matter to remove the nitrate. So once it's in the groundwater, it's pretty stable, and it's probably there for 1,000 years. But some is always being removed. If you put septic drainage into the aquifer, it appears that you get some nitrate removal in the aquifer because there's organic matter going in with the septic drainage. There's organic matter that's not taken out in a drain field, a lot of it, from a septic tank. But the best way to deal with surface waters that has been proven for a long time now is to do what they've done for phosphorus in the Everglades, and that is to build wetlands. The wetland plants operate off of solar power. They generate organic carbon, very large amounts of it, and they're anaerobic because of the amount of carbon they're generating. The decomposition process is using up the oxygen in the water. So wetlands have the perfect characteristics to remove nitrate in water, which they do. They can also remove ammonia to a certain extent and organic nitrogen to a certain extent, but they're fantastic at removing nitrate. In fact, they're probably 10 to 100 times more efficient at removing nitrate nitrogen than they are removing phosphorus like the ones that are designed for the Everglades. And that's why there's like 60,000 acres of the SCAs that Gary and I worked on in the Everglades. But a much smaller wetland can do the job for nitrate. For example, in North Florida, we're in the process now of converting more and more of these land application wastewater disposal systems to wetlands, to groundwater recharge wetlands. Lake City recently did this in 2015, converted their spray field to a wetland system that now is removing essentially all the nitrate in the water before it ever recharges the aquifer that feeds Ichetucknee Springs. There's a new recharge wetland going in Gainesville. The city of High Springs, the little town where this picture was taken, is putting in a groundwater recharge wetland. So, and then there's Orlando, puts their water through a wetland, and it goes to surface water in the St. Johns River, but it removes all the nitrate and all the nitrogen. So there is a way to do it. We're not always using the smartest technologies to do things, but we need to because these things are expensive.
I normally only read questions and not comments, but we have a comment from one guest that leads in really nicely to a question from another guest. So one of our attendees says that we should elect politicians who pay attention to science, especially freshwater. We need a political revolution to actively support those politicians who understand this. And I think that's critical to all of Florida's water issues. So the follow-up question from a different attendee: has Governor DeSantis been supportive of efforts to restore Florida's springs?
Well, he says he is. Governor DeSantis came in saying a lot of great things. And certainly there's still $50 million a year going to what they call springs protection from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Rick Scott, after stopping all the springs monitoring and the Springs Task Force and other springs programs in his first few years in office, started taking a lot of heat and said he was going to protect springs by putting $1 billion in the springs in the next 10 years. Well, the legislature liked that idea and put $50 million a year in the springs. It's locked into the law. The unfortunate thing is that the money's not being used, not all of it, and much of it is not being used to really constructively help the springs. It's going to secondary things like upgrading wastewater treatment plants, connecting septic tanks, things like that. It's not really going into protecting the springs by putting these conservation easements on the big polluters and things like that. So I think Governor DeSantis will take credit for the $50 million a year, but I know there was a recent request to the governor, if you're going to put $200 million a year or $400 million a year in the Everglades, you need to put just as much into the springs in North Florida. They're just as important as the Everglades in Florida. There aren't as many people living up here, but there are a lot of people using the springs, tens of millions of people a year, and the springs are not going to be here. They're not as far along on the protection timeline as the Everglades are, and I think they will be. The awareness is growing in Tallahassee. They can feel the heat. There's a lot of people, 19,000 comments on the Jenny Springs permit, on the Nestle permit. 19,000 comments came in, all opposing it, or 99% of them opposing the permit. So the political pressure is there, but the people of Florida need to work together, like I said, to solve these issues. We need to be putting pressure on to use the science, to follow the science. And the state science says that you will protect the flows in these natural systems, and you will protect the water quality in these natural systems, and our state is not doing that.
Well, your answer to that question leads us perfectly to our next question. What actions can we as Floridians take to demand that big corporations and farms pay for their impact? What about demanding that municipalities switch from septic to sewer? Are there any alternatives to septic other than connecting directly to municipal sewer?
Well, septic tanks aren't all bad. Septic tanks, unless you don't like people in Florida at all, but they're not all bad. Septic tanks on 5 acres are not a water quality problem. They're, right under the septic tank, you don't want to be drinking that water, but they're not a water quality problem because the dilution in 5 acres basically lowers the overall impact on 5 acres of a single family septic tank system to the equivalent of the nitrogen coming in from rainfall. So, but it's when you have septic tanks, 3 acres and 1 acre, and you have septic tanks on 1/10 of an acre, there you have serious problems. You're magnifying the problems. And so I've forgotten the question, Zach.
I think the question started with a pretty broad question. What can we do? What can we do to hold companies and farms accountable? What can we do to make them pay for their impact? Was the start of the question.
Well, the fundamental problem is the state. The governor appoints the head of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. The governor appoints the executive directors of all 5 water management districts. The governor appoints all the water management district members. And we don't have a single environmentalist on any of the water management districts other than South Florida Water Management District. None. They're all business people that benefit from using water. So it starts with the governor, and nothing is going to get really better unless we have a governor that believes in a sustainable environment for his future. But then local governments are just as important. Local governments can do so much in terms of zoning and in terms of issuing permits, building permits. So work on your local government. And some of our local governments are really great. And some are just as bad as the state government. So I'm afraid that the only way to win the game is to win the politics, because that's the way the law is. We've gone after several egregious actions by the state. They issued a minimum flow and level for Rainbow Springs intended to protect Rainbow Springs that says it will protect Rainbow Springs, that basically allows them to continue issuing permits around Rainbow Springs for the next 100 years. There's really no limits in the actual technical writing of the minimum flow and level. And we challenged that, and it was terribly flawed. And we had a great case, but we had an administrative hearing officer that didn't have a clue and acted on behalf of the state. The same thing happened on 5 basin management action plans for 5 different spring systems. We challenged those. We had a great case. We had DEP staff in the audience cheering us on against their own agency that we're challenging those BMAPs. We just got the action. It took the hearing officer over a year to rule on it because we had a great case. And somehow at the end, she ruled, and this does not, makes me think there was a political decision here. She ruled that, well, they complied with the letter of the law, so everything was all right, even though we proved over and over again that the springs were being destroyed by nitrogen pollution, and that best management practices don't work on these karst areas. They don't work at all. So I'm afraid politics is where it's at, and politics, the only way to win politics is to win your neighbors' hearts. And that seems to be harder than ever, but I wish you the best. I'm certainly working to do that.
Do we currently have any legislators who support a cap and fee proposal on groundwater withdrawal? And do you think that that should only apply to new withdrawals, or should be proactive or retroactive on existing users?
Now, it needs to apply to all withdrawals so that there's a level playing field. Nobody should be grandfathered in, and no use is so small that it shouldn't be monitored. All groundwater extractions, in other words, every well should have a monitoring device on it. And that's not hard to do. The USGS has developed a simple little gadget you can put on the electric meter feeding a well and estimate pretty accurately the amount of water that's being used. I know they've been using mine as a test well for years. That works. And every well should be monitored. Not even the big wells are all being monitored. A fraction of them are. Every well should be reported, and that you should be reported. There should be an adequate amount of water provided to every citizen of Florida. The citizens own the water. Everybody should get their first 5,000 or 10,000 gallons a month free. They shouldn't be any charge for that. Nobody should. Even in the city, there shouldn't be a charge for that. The people that want to use more than that should be paying for it. Every use over that, and there should be tiered rates, just like there are in the city. There should be tiered rates for all uses. And I tell you, agriculture will stop irrigating when that happens. it'd be too expensive for them. And it is too expensive for us, for the people of Florida, to give away that water for irrigation unless it's absolutely necessary. And there are ways through hydroponics to continue our intensive agriculture in Florida, to recycle the nutrients so none of them are going to the environment, and to recycle the water so there's a minimal amount of groundwater extraction. And that's being done in other parts of the world right now. The solutions are all right in front of us. They're just a departure from the status quo. And the lobbying of the associated industries of Florida is basically running the state of Florida right now, in my opinion.
So obviously agriculture and other industries are lobbying hard to prevent any changes to current extraction rates. Is anybody lobbying in the other direction? Are there any organizations that are actively pushing from a political perspective to try to move this in a better direction for the health of our aquifer?
In terms of a fee on water, there actually was a bill introduced last year. I think there's a bill that may actually make it somewhere this year about a fee for bottled water only, but bottled water is a very, very small fraction of the water that we're using right now. But yeah, the only group that's actively lobbying for this is the Florida Springs Council, which is I mentioned, and they're doing that on an annual budget of less than $100,000. So help, you know, let's get together.
Seems like they might benefit from some of that. Seems like they may benefit from some of that license plate money, right?
Well, they're getting some, but yeah, they should. But you can't use that kind of money for political action, really. They're depending on private donors and foundations for their money, and they're getting more and more successful. It's really only a few years old. We've only had an executive director there for a little over a year, and they're surviving. They're growing, but the problems are so large that they can't do all the work. It's heavy lifting. And I know you know about that from South Florida and the Everglades Foundation and the Everglades Coalition, and the amount of public donations and money supporting those groups is enormous. And we're way behind that, unfortunately.
Bob, we have time for one last question, and I want to thank all of you who've hung out for this extended Q&A session. We still have probably 150 people logged in right now watching, even though we've been chatting for over 30 minutes. The final question is about health issues associated with nitrates. We talked about potential cancer links to nitrate exposure. Are there any studies that you know of regarding the impacts of high nitrate levels on wildlife, mammals, fish, birds, and reptiles? Are they having issues associated with nitrate contamination?
There's some literature reviews and a little bit of literature out there. There's been some studies of nitrate levels in manatees. I mean, think the water the manatees are drinking. They're not all drinking from hoses in South Florida. They're in the springs. They're drinking the spring water, and a lot of the spring water is contaminated with nitrate. But I don't know of any conclusive studies. There's a literature review that was done that indicates that the nitrate levels could be harmful to other organisms, like amphibians, for example, to snails, for example. And I'm pretty sure that the nitrate itself is harmful to submerged aquatic vegetation to a certain extent, although it hasn't been shown conclusively. So yeah, there are likely to be toxic effects of nitrate to more than just humans. Nitrate in the human body in anaerobic conditions, it can form a nitrosamine, and all nitrosamines are carcinogenic. And it's research on humans, none has been conducted in Florida. We've worked hard to get money to do that in Florida, but none has been done, even though there's high cancer incidence in the Suwannee River Basin, where I showed you the nitrate levels are so high up there. There's likely a lot of cancers around that are undetected in terms of their relationship to nitrate. But in other states like Iowa, Minnesota, and North Carolina, extensive studies have been done that have shown that there's like I said, an increased risk, no smoking gun, but an increased risk of cancer up to 5 times higher at levels that we have all over the place in our drinking water.
All right, Bob, I can't thank you enough for spending your evening with us. What a great lecture. what a great audience and fantastic questions. We really appreciate you sharing a little bit of North Florida with us down here in Southeast Florida. And I know we've got viewers from not just around the state, but around the country tuned in for this program tonight. I hope it inspires all of you to give our springs a little more attention. We're also invested in the Everglades story, but I think it's really Florida's water story, not South Florida's water story. A reminder to everybody, please register for next week's talk. We're going to get to learn all about these incredible sawfish that live in our local waters, and we'll definitely see you 1 week from tonight, I hope at least. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you again, Bob. Thank you to all of our attendees, and have a great evening.